Awesome. So today's a bit of a combined lesson. We had a bit of a tight schedule last week, and we are going to be looking at some CSS layout principles and techniques and CSS features related to layout, which is, if not the most important thing we use CSS for, one of the most important. And we're also going to look a bit at this approach that's become sort of the very modern standard for using CSS called responsive web design and a bit of Bootstrap. So we are going to cover a lot of ground this morning, but there's a couple main things that we're going to focus on. And I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to open up my demos and notes repository, and we can just live in there. And I don't have a directory for the stuff for today, so I'm going to make it. I'm going to use the list ls command to kind of just double check. And I'm going to use the make dir command to make our week 4 day 1 CSS layout responsive design directory. I'm going to cd into that directory. And I was trying to use the tab to autocomplete, which it will do for directory paths, and it wasn't, because I have a typo here with the D. It's not WD4, it's week 4. So that's a really good reason why using tab when you're like writing out longer paths or file names to autocomplete on the terminal is actually quite nice, because it helps you get typos. And I'm always using the print working directory command and the ls list command just to make sure I know where I am in the terminal. I'm going to use the touch command to create some files. I don't know if you've seen this before, but you can create multiple files at once with the touch command. And that should have created 3 files for me right off the bat. And if I go here, I now have these 3 files. And the Explorer bar is a little less useful at the moment, so I'm probably going to leave it closed. And I'm going to just start putting in some notes here, and we're going to talk about CSS layout and responsive web design. So first off, please don't code along. It's not going to be productive, and I'm going to be throwing a lot of code out there relatively quickly. We'll be using Chrome developer tools a lot of the time too. So this is more of ask a lot of questions, please. And actually in that vein, if someone wants to, did we already create a Sierra questions doc that we had been talking about for last week? Can someone, I don't remember, can someone help me out?
I'll create one and post it in the chat.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. Yeah, thank you, Zainab. Or yeah, and if someone, if a student wants to keep an eye on like the Zoom chat too, and whenever I've been trying to like, whenever someone like has a good resource, to make sure it goes in the resources channel. If someone wouldn't mind keeping an eye on the chat and like putting resources and questions in their appropriate places so we can come back to it later, that'd be awesome. Thank you, Zainab. I will pin that to the channel or something. Yes, today is a combination of Friday and today. That's correct. The CSS layout part is what's from Friday, and then the responsive design is more of today. The good news is they overlap a bit. And at the end of the lesson too, we'll talk about kind of what assignment to focus on, because it is a bit of cramming 2 days into one. However, with the pace of the course, we do have to just make sure that we keep on rolling. Actually, I'm going to grab my coffee and then we will keep on rolling. So there's a couple of major concepts that you'll learn today. It's called like the CSS document flow, or just, you'll hear people talk about the flow with HTML. We're going to talk a bit more about the box model. And there's going to be a couple other things. CSS's display property, that's going to be a big one. CSS's position property, and then media queries, which you'll learn about, but don't have to worry about immediately using. And some things that we're going to demonstrate. Some basic CSS layout patterns.
Adam, I don't mean to interrupt, but can you
Yeah.
shrink the size of your terminal so we can see more of the notes?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great
Thank you.
call. Absolutely. Thank you, Chris. Yeah, and folks, let me know if there are issues with audio or visual stuff at any point. There's going to be a bunch of things that we will demo using Bootstrap, which is the UI framework that heavily leverages CSS. And it's sort of an industry standard. And actually, yeah, I should put that down as something that we'll learn about too, because we're going to talk about what Bootstrap is. And you will also see a lot of how to use Chrome DevTools. And just to give you a heads up, the major takeaways are going to be to use Chrome DevTools a lot. You're going to see me do this, but you kind of want to prototype in DevTools and then make changes to your CSS file. That's going to be a much more productive way and a good workflow for working with CSS. I would say another takeaway is going to be CSS is complicated, but there are a few core features we use 80% of the time. And the last one is probably that front end is complicated. It has a lot of moving parts. There's the browser, there's CSS, there's HTML, there's JavaScript, and they all interact. And the last one is that Bootstrap is great. Bootstrap is honestly great. It's been around forever, and I'll talk about a bit more about what it is as we get into it. I just need to quickly readjust my Zoom windows a bit. So please bear with me, folks. Okay, let's do it. So I'm going to take a look at this index.html file that I created. As we saw the other day, I'm going to make some HTML tags. I'm going to give it a head. I'm going to give it a body. I just kind of want to get the ball rolling. I'm going to give it a div. It's pretty normal to wrap stuff in divs. That actually is a good thing to add as a takeaway. Like, you don't want to add too many divs, but wrapping something in a div is a pretty common go-to strategy. And I'm going to write hello world, and I'm going to use this live server VS Code extension that we installed the other day. Oh, I don't want to break point. To launch my website. And I'm doing this because this way, when I save a file, I think live server automatically updates it Though actually it would work equally well with the Python website, of course, because now that I think about it, we're always going to be fetching. So either one will work. It's a bit of a personal preference, I would say. I think, with Django, we will be using the Python server a bit more. So we'll end up doing a good amount of that. For the moment, I've got live server going, I'm going to roll with it. So again, I like to do things one step at a time. I know I haven't done anything silly in my HTML. I'm going to open up DevTools, view developer, and any of these opens up the whole window. And it's really here in the Elements tab where we're going to want to live. And the big takeaway, and by the way, this JavaScript script here, this is all inserted by live view, and this is how it watches files. And I don't have to refresh the page to get the changes that I made to my HTML file. That's a little bit, it's not magic, but that's a little bit of nifty stuff that live view does. And again, I think the big takeaway here is none of this stuff is magic. Like once you start poking under the hood, it's all code in one language or another and conventions and things like that. And we don't really have to worry too much about how live view is working. I just kind of wanted to point that out. I think a good starting point is I'm going to create some divs and a little bit of CSS, and we can do a bit of review and talk a bit about the display tag, and then I'll talk about like the box model, excuse me, and CSS flow. So I'm going to go ahead and make a div here. This should look pretty familiar to folks who took a look at the curriculum. We are going to mix it up a bit. I noticed by the colors here being different that I have a typo, the way that these are all blue, and then this is blue, but this is not blue. And it looks like I'm missing a double quote. And now things should be working as desired. And now that it's blue again. And let's see. So we've got some stuff, nothing crazy. So I use this ID attribute to give this div a unique ID. I use the class attribute to give these divs a CSS class. That CSS class currently does not exist. Our browser doesn't care. It goes ahead and renders it anyway. And if I inspect one of those elements, I can see that there are no CSS styles at all. You'll note that the div has a display property by default. By default in CSS, almost everything has display property blocked, and we'll talk about what that means in a second. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to go ahead and create this box CSS class. And let's see why I get the red squiggly. Okay, so this is VS Code telling me I shouldn't have a CSS class with nothing in it, a CSS rule with a rule set without any rules. For the moment, as long as this doesn't break the browser, we don't care because I actually want to use DevTools to start adding some rules. So if I go here, nothing seems broken. I always like checking the console too. If something has really broken, you'll see it there. It looks like the browser is probably ignoring this because it's empty. So let's add some kind of rule in here. Let's do just font size 14 pixels. Oh, and of course, none of this is happening because what did I forget to do with my HTML file that we care about if we want to use some CSS?
Gotta add the link.
Yeah, totally. And how do I do that?
For CSS, I think it's a link and then rel style sheet and then href address.
Yep. And where in the HTML document do I want to do that?
In the head. By the way, I think your head body on lines 14 and 15 are kind of swapped.
Thank you. I just noticed that too. I totally missed that before. I'm going to use the Command-Shift-P command to sort of get our nifty tools to format the document. So everything looks nice. Just like you were saying, we're going to use the link element with the href attribute and point it to where our styles file live, our styles CSS file lives. And then we need to talk about the relationship of this asset, this style sheet, to the HTML document. And the browser understands this special string keyword style sheet. And let's see if that does it, or if it needs to be a self-closing tag. No, and we're good. And that was in fact the problem that I had before. And so now what I want to start doing is, this is going to be by far, I think, the easiest way to experiment and play with CSS. Add stuff in DevTools. And can everyone read DevTools okay? Is the font size okay for seeing what's going on? Awesome. I added a height. I added a width. I'm going to add a border. Because then we can see the different elements more visually. A lot of CSS attributes or CSS rules, you can define them like there is a border color attribute, I believe. And border width. And I want to say border style. I noticed that using these three things does the same thing as what I did here, where you can use the border rule and do sort of a shortcut of combining all those rules together. When you're learning, it's really whichever approach is going to be easier for you. The main thing to know is that they're both two ways of doing the exact same thing. I apologize. I wanted to make this a little bigger. So the other interesting thing to note here as I hover over these is the width is only 100 pixels, but we see stuff extending all the way across the screen. And then if I hover over here, we can see what it is, and it's specifically the margin of the elements. And this is a great time to talk about the CSS box model. And I think that this visual tool is going to be the right starting point. There's two things really, like the idea of document flow and the box model. And I'm going to write a little bit about this, but I'm mostly going to talk and then show you the Mozilla developer docs on these, which honestly are incredible and everybody's go-to, and which should always be your starting point. So stuff flows left to right. Stuff flows top to bottom. And by stuff, I mean HTML elements. And by default, an HTML element will take up the full width. Let's call it like it's box. Will take up the full width of the browser window. And you're going to start hearing terms like window, viewport, document. I'll try to be precise, but if you hear like window, viewport, screen, in the context, we're talking about what you see here, the stuff where this HTML lives. Like the browser window is now a lot smaller. And now it's bigger, right? So it is sort of dynamic, and that's kind of where we have to use these terms. And this, I would say, is really highly recommended reading for everyone. And in fact, here's a much more accurate description than an HTML element, a block level element, which is a better way to describe it. And I'll do my best to stick with. This should be in our curriculum notes as well, but I'll add it here. And Jim, I think you're correct that the viewport is something different, and it's going to relate to, yeah, like the size of the screen that the browser window is on. I apologize. You're absolutely right about that. So just kind of running along with the sort of prototyping that I was doing. So what happens here, unfortunately, especially with live server, is that it's pretty aggressive about refreshing stuff. And I lost the work that I had here. So it's sort of like as you go. You're not going to be able to copy and paste, unfortunately. I guess you can if you go here to look at it sort of as storing the temporary file. You can even set it up where this saves to your browser. I don't have that set up at the moment. But point being, I've prototyped it out. I have a rough idea of what I want. And now I can make the changes here. And it's way better to start in the browser and mess around with stuff in DevTools because you get just a much faster workflow. And I'm going to add this display property. Block is the default setting, but we're going to change it in a moment and see what happens. So the neat thing is when I'm messing with stuff in DevTools, if I want to mess with this one specific element I've selected, I can use this element style here. That just changes the one element. Over here, because I'm changing the rule for the CSS class, it changes everything. So here I'm going to change this display to inline. And this is the other great thing about using DevTools is that you don't have to hit enter, and I can use the up and down arrows to move through these, and you can see all the different options. So again, this is really the way to explore this. And I think the big takeaway here is that the display property is kind of deceptively named because it determines the rules that the browser uses, like how to display this in the flow. Like a block element is your sort of default HTML element. It stretches the full width of the browser window of the page, and then things are kind of laid out vertically as you go. There are some elements that are not block level elements. Like if I added Let's see if it'll let me do it inside here. I'll just do it here. If I add a span tag, a span is designed for us to put stuff in line, in one line. And now I need to wait for this to update. And oh,
It's already there on the top one.
thank you. I totally missed it. I just was confused with DevTools. Thank you, Zainab. I think if I go to computed, yeah, so the computed tab is if you're not sure what CSS rules are being applied to an element, this is where you can see like the browser's final decision, and it tells us display inline. And unlike font size, where that's a rule that we set in a file of ours, for a span tag, display inline is default. So I want to go ahead and change this to inline block. And block and inline block are the two most useful display properties as a general rule. There are various things like that make inline block, like why we care about it. Let's see here. And actually, this is a great example. Let me go ahead and clean this up a bit. I want to comment out my span, so I'm kind of reorganizing my work. And again, the HTML file doesn't care about like this empty space and stuff here. So inline, as the term sounds, it means that content gets displayed in a row and does not by default take up the full width, that a block is displayed inline and doesn't take up the full width of the screen. So this is inline. This is inline block. There's a pretty big difference.
Adam, can you go to
Yeah.
computed and tell us why some of those things were grayed out or muted out? And then, so if you click there, we saw earlier, you looked at something and it was full color. The colors, the border range, those titles over there, some were full color and some were muted.
Let me see if I can find that in border.
Well, it wasn't necessarily border, it was just one of those things. I think it was, I don't know, maybe it was in the,
Yeah, I know what you're talking about. The short answer is if it's grayed out in computed, it's probably because that rule is not being applied. I'm
or
not
overwritten or something.
Yeah, overridden, exactly. I'm not 100%, but I think that's what's going on. Like I know that, like, you know, when you see something crossed out here, it means that it's being overridden. My guess is that that's what it means as well, but let's actually.
Yes, that's kind of my question. How in the future will we figure out what is overriding it and why it's lined out or grayed out?
Yeah. Oh, interesting. I actually did not know this. It looks like gray calculated properties are not default or inherited, which is good to know. I wouldn't necessarily, I would want to double check that. Yeah, the short answer is CSS rules, once you start having a couple classes interacting, can get complicated. quite quickly. And just keeping CSS organized so it's not a huge mess to figure things out is a big task. But honestly, the way you figure things out is you kind of just have, like, before developer tools got quite good, you would have to kind of sit there and I think just write down the rules and follow them by hand and kind of understand the order that they were applied. These days, honestly, I would say what everyone does is use dev tools and experiment, like by removing rules until you get down to something basic and looking at compute it again and then re-adding them. It's really sort of like Chrome dev tools is like your microscope to figure this stuff out, is the analogy that I would use. Yeah, that's a great question. It is also one of those things where, like with everything, as you do more of it, like you will start remembering the basic principles, and that comes with time too. And the starting point is really the box model. And actually, I did want to talk explicitly about that. Document flow and the box model are the two big things. Everything is kind of considered like a block or a box, like every HTML element, and then everything else goes from there. This display property is a big one. There are some significant differences, as you can see, between inline and inline block that have to do with like how margin and padding are handled. But the big difference is block, where stuff takes the full width and is laid out vertically, versus something else, often inline, in one form or another, where stuff is laid out horizontally and does not take out the full width by default. And that's kind of the starting point. And let me actually talk about the CSS box model, because we've kind of seen it, but I think it's really good to talk a bit explicitly about it. And again, I'm using the Mozilla Web Developer docs because they're just extremely well done. And it is hard to talk about this stuff precisely, and they do a very good job. And as they say here, the browser represents every element as a rectangular box, according to the CSS box model. CSS will determine the size and the position and the properties, which are numerous, of these boxes. A box has a couple basic parts. We don't have to worry too much about like the content edge and things like that. To kind of summarize, there is content, there is padding around the content, which can be empty space. There is the border around the padding, and then the margin, which is more empty space, which sounds like a lot. But again, the context for this is in the world of print design, of design for text and visual media, for books and magazines and things like that. All this stuff already existed. And that was sort of like the nomenclature and a lot of the concepts used for how do I lay out the way that a newspaper looks. And someone was like, well, we want to be able to do this in an HTML document on the web. And so this was sort of the conceptual model that they came up with. There's a bunch of rules around content padding and so on. I think the best next step, though, is for me to start adding some stuff in here so we can see the box model visually. So let me make the border bigger. Let me add padding of, let's say, 10 pixels and a margin of 20 pixels. Some advice that I got that I think is pretty good in terms of how to organize CSS rules, because it does, they can get long sometimes, is to go alphabetically unless there's like something where it really makes sense to combine them together. Like height and width, that's not alphabetical, but those kind of go together. There's no one rule or right way, and honestly, you'll end up doing it however your company does. And let me also give a background color of, let's use like a really ugly green. And now let's look at one of these things and we can look at the box model. So we've got the content. And note that the actual text I have doesn't take up a ton of space, but according to the box model, we kind of need to have all of this content space. And the reason is because we have set the height and width. And the height and width are really about the content area of the box. Because if I get rid of those, then the content part of the box is much more tightly mapped to the actual content itself. And I'm going to add the height and width again so we can see the padding a bit more. Let me change the color so it's easier to see the padding. Maybe like antique white. Yeah, can people see the padding that's highlighted right now when I'm hovering over this? Awesome. So this is helpful. And when positioning stuff like, and when the browser is calculating how much room there is, it does like count the padding. The padding is sort of considered inside. And then we've got a border, and then we've got a margin, which takes up a lot of space. And like, let me bump up, and you can do, by the way, like we saw with the border property, we can do margin top, margin right, margin bottom, margin left. So margin right is interesting. And a good design principle with CSS is you kind of think about like pushing stuff up against each other, sort of like left to right. So like if I make the margin right really big, let's see if it lets me change this here this way. It doesn't want to do that. So I'm going to very quickly do it like this: top, bottom, left, right. And let's make the margin right even bigger, like maybe 200 pixels. And here's where we get into, I was talking about the flow. Well, each of the boxes for these blocks now takes up a huge amount of the horizontal space on this row because just of the margin. And so now this one gets pushed onto the next row. And I believe we can do something similar with padding. Oh yeah, text align center is a great one. That's a great point. Let me demonstrate that right now, in fact. Let's just throw that in there. Yeah, centering stuff in CSS is always a bit of a trick. So note that the margin doesn't affect really content positioning because the margin is sort of outside the content zone. But if I change the padding to be like, let's see, 40 pixels, 80 pixels, now it starts to get interesting. And and this is why Chrome Developer Tools is really your friend, because CSS it's a visual medium. It's way easier to use the dev tools to look at this stuff. Again, content not taking up that much space. The reason that it takes up all that empty space is the width and height properties, which affect the size of the content part of the box. Padding takes up a good amount of space. There are slightly different rules for padding and margin and what gets applied when, and that's kind of actually where like display inline versus inline block starts to matter. I always have to look this up. Let's see, display inline padding versus margin.
Adam, it seems like you started out with, and I added in the document, you are started with margin 20 pixels, and then there became available margin left, right, top, and bottom. Isn't there a way you can give those 4 arguments behind?
Yes.
Like if
And
you do
actually, I should-
margin.
Yeah. And that's a really good point. Actually, I did that, but I didn't explain it. So let me,
And isn't it, there's also, you can do, if you only do 2 arguments, doesn't it identify it as top and bottom and left and right or something?
yeah, it's like top, right, bottom, left. Basically, the margin 20 pixels just by itself, that's shorthand for all the margin settings being 20 pixels, top, bottom, left, right. And there are other shorthands too, like I think you're right, like margin top might, you can also do this, like 20px, 20px, 10px, 4px, and it will, let's see what exactly this is. I want to say it goes clockwise, like top, right, bottom, left, but I'm not sure. Honestly, I kind of like writing it out more explicitly because it's easy to read and I don't have to remember between the 3 different ways to kind of do the same thing in CSS. But the shorthand one is extremely useful, that if you just want the margin of the padding for everything to be 10 pixels, then you can just set that right there. And let's see here. Yeah, it's like, this is where inline and inline block kind of gets interesting. I have to Google exactly what the rules are, but essentially inline block takes a lot of the block rules and preserves them, and is really what we want to use most of the time for layout and things like that. Inline is more like with the example of a span or like a line of text, or like 2 words in a line of text that we want to highlight or something, or maybe an image, because you'll note here that stuff ends up being radically different. Like there's not, the main thing is I've got this height and width here with inline block. The browser is kind of treating all this stuff like a block. And even though the width and height is all empty space, the browser respects that. If I just use inline, because display inline is really meant for, again, think of like 2 words in a sentence that you want to make bold or blue or something, it gets rid of white space. There are some other rules, but the main takeaway is that for layout purposes, you will probably use inline block most of the time. Inline block or block. This is probably a good point for me to check in because I've just been talking about a lot of stuff. And honestly, this is a significant amount of Friday's lecture that we covered. I'm going to talk a bit, I think, about CSS positioning, and then honestly probably move on just to make sure that we cover everything that we want to for responsive web design. And also because CSS has a lot of moving parts and you don't need to start using them all right away. The box model and this idea of flow are the 2 really big concepts. Those are like the most critical ones. And again, going back to the box model, we can see kind of there's this content area, then we've got padding around it, then we've got the border, and then we have the margin. And depending on the display property for each element, for each block, the margin gets handled differently. The margin kind of like fills all available space. Like our margin right setting here, it's 80 pixels, but I'll change it just 20. But for like the block rule, the margin is just going to fill whatever empty space there is. And then when we put this inline block rather, because there's less empty space, the margin is less big. And the inline rule is kind of applying stuff. And if we look at this whole div here, and this is the other crazy part, the blocks are composed of blocks, like each of these is a block. But this div, which doesn't have any special CSS styles or anything, this is also a block. And its content is other blocks. And in fact, let me go ahead and border, let's do 4px dashed, can I do cyan? Yeah, so border, you can do dashed borders, which is kind of cool. And let's give this, yes, someone had a
Yeah,
question.
there's a website out there that it's kind of like this really simple HTML page, or excuse me, it's a page, and when you turn it off, you see none of the CSS, but you see this perfectly formed hierarchical CL or HTML page. It's pretty cool to see. I don't know where it is, but it kind of shows what your stuff looks like with and without the CSS applied.
Oh, that's awesome. See what a page looks like without CSS. Let's see if we can find. I'm not sure if I can find it. If you do find it, please share it. That would be awesome to see. Yeah, what is really interesting is if you pick any website, it's like, let me use the New York Times again as an example. And we'll ignore that giant ad. And we'll look at like their banner. And you can see this stuff, it gets quite complicated. But here's a great example of the title. And let's look at it in the box model down here. And let me bring this up a bit. So that's the content. And they're using a custom font asset that they've loaded via probably a link tag. There's not a lot of padding. There's a little bit of border. And then there's a lot of margin. And they're doing all this stuff to center it. The term is masthead, like the masthead of the newspaper page. The more front end you do, the more kind of design stuff you learn. And there are probably some other CSS rules here and stuff, but like we can mess with this. Like, let's see what we can play with. Like I can mess with that margin setting, width, height, looking at computed can be kind of interesting. And you can always override stuff right here. Like, let's see if I do margin 0. Yeah, so whatever I put in here, because it's just in DevTools, it doesn't, nothing is saved to a file, but we'll override all the other rules. This element.style class is sort of a browser's built-in way, I think, of keeping track of some stuff where it might just be specific for DevTools. But so here I can add stuff and play with things and we can see what it's like. And if we add some padding, like you can really start to mess stuff up. And it's interesting. It's a lot of fun. And this is a great example. This is an unordered list, but somewhere in here, they've set the flow so that it's going left to right with an inline style. Like if I look at these and I look at the computed style and I search for display, it's interesting. Display is block. It gets complicated because there's also like, yeah, we're going to talk about Flexbox. Flexbox kind of like changes the whole game. That's like a more recent addition to CSS that's quite powerful and is a pretty great layout tool. But using Flexbox is dramatically easier with like a good understanding of the box model, and it still is using all the rules of CSS flow. And here again, we can see the same thing where we've got an element. It's got border and padding. And then this unordered list, the content is all the other blocks inside of it, right? The box has boxes inside of it. There's a bit of padding. And then there's some margin that they use to kind of center everything. So yeah, what's on people's minds? And then it's probably a good time to take a break. Great question. How do you center a div? Yeah, we'll look at that one in a second. What else is on people's minds about the box model, about flow, about the display property?
I had a question. So the box model that we're following here, can we apply the same, I guess, properties to different elements inside of a CSS? So like the button, the menu, looks like the list as well. Could we, I guess, use the padding and the margins to position it the way that we want, or is it just for box content? Hopefully I'm using that
Great
right.
question. Yeah, no, we use it for everything. And I think the way to think about it is like every single HTML element, and that's a great question. I'm glad you asked that. Like the challenge, part of the challenge here is we have a lot of different stuff. Like we can also have, let's see here, how do I do an HTML dropdown? I haven't done this one in a minute. I'm just going to copy, paste this, which normally I discourage, but that's fine. I'm going to stick it in a div just so it lives somewhere if it needs a home. Let's see if that breaks anything or if this works. Yep, so we've got this here. So you can have a lot of different kinds of HTML elements, buttons, text, images, drop downs. The challenge is how do I create a tool that I can use to control the layout of all of it? And the box model is applied to everything. This select drop down, we absolutely can do stuff to it. Like it has an ID named cars. I could also give it a class if I wanted to. Class car drop down styles. And then in my CSS file, I could either use the selector to get this by ID, or I could use the class selector. And again, let's say padding 20px, border 4px, solid green, margin 10. And there, I mean, there's a wealth of CSS rules. I'm kind of sticking with padding, border, and margin because they're useful visually for looking at layout. But there's a ton of different rules. And so here again, we see that box model in action. And so the box model is like the unifying principle for how we lay out everything with HTML and CSS. That's a great question. Thank you for asking that. And does that make sense to folks? And you can kind of see it in action here. Yeah, and like with the button, this is actually great. Like the button, let's give the button an ID. ID equals the button. Let's use the ID selector. So we're going to find the element whose ID is the button. Let's give it a color of blue. Let's give it you can also use, like, here we go, box shadow of, I don't know, 4px. VS Code will autocomplete different available CSS rules, which is a great way to explore them. Text. Let's try background color. Let's try green. This color, I think, is more for text color. But then if like we do font size 40px, it should be pretty huge now. Yeah, so now our button is a little ridiculous. Note that the color property sets the text color, the background property sets the color of the background behind the content. And then we have just all these other rules that we applied that make it a little crazy. And I'm curious, let's see what the display property of the button is. It's inline block, which makes sense that a button would have, let's see if that's, let's see where that comes from. Yeah, so the browser's default button CSS styles are inline block. Maybe we want to change that. Maybe the way I want to do that is I want to use a div and I want to use my box class. And this is a really common approach too, where you kind of use a div as a container. And let's say we're going to go back to our box having a display of block. And now we've got all this stuff. We've got the button down here. It's pretty ugly, to be honest. You'll note that the button is too big to like live inside its container. And that's how you get all that weird looking stuff. And so we have to go back and we would say, hey, I can't hard code these values in. And you can in fact make like width and height be relative values. 40 pixels is too big, which is part of the problem. And we'll talk about different ways of doing that. And now the button's much smaller. Yeah, what other questions do people have? What else is on people's minds? Yeah, great questions. And someone has their hand up, I think.
Yeah, I got another question. So because we're working with so many different elements and trying to design this, you know, if we were starting from scratch, I don't think we've mentioned it, but do you recommend frameworking and kind of putting stuff down on paper first as to, hey, this is how I want it to look, and then using that as a model to kind of organize our web pages or whatever we're doing?
Honestly, yeah, I do. Like, this is where programming starts to overlap with design, right? Because a lot of the times you might have a designer on the team and they'll design the layout of the website. And then you will use some HTML and CSS to make that happen and come to life. And even then you will probably want to use some paper to figure this stuff out, because you have to think about like margins and padding and percentages. We're going to see Bootstrap in a bit, and that helps with a lot. There are some really common layout patterns. And I wanted to see if this, yeah, this is a good example. Like, this is a great site. And I want to say, yeah, and this CSS now has the CSS grid, which makes a lot of this stuff easier. Really, CSS grid and Flexbox, which is display flex and display grid, are kind of game changers. And we'll see those later. Before that, this stuff was much more of a pain. But there are like certain common patterns, like CSS 3-column, like the 3-column layout is a super common pattern. I just want to find a good visual of it really for the moment. There we go. So like, this is a common way that a website is laid out. This is a common way too. And you can kind of see like, and in fact, let me see if I can like put together a terrible 3-column layout relatively quickly, and then we'll break. Does that sound good to folks? Or should we break now and then do a 3-column layout?
Break.
Yeah, it's been long. Yeah, let's break. It's 10:13. Let's come back at 10:30. What I think I'll do is throw together a 3-column layout. I'll share both of these links. This is actually a really good one. Like, these are some very common layout patterns. And you can do most stuff. Like most websites are variations on this theme. To go back to the New York Times, like they have a header, and we can ignore all the junk inside the header, but this is one div, right? And then it has the body, which is a ton of stuff. But again, you can build this up piece by piece. So to go back to your question, you kind of want to start with like the biggest part of the layout. You could also think about it kind of as like building a pyramid, like you lay down the 3 big blocks first and everything goes on top of that. And then somewhere down way at the bottom here is the footer, though I think they have, okay, they don't have an endless scroll. But so here's like the footer. But then like you can stick like a 3-column layout inside a 3-column layout. So once you kind of start thinking about this stuff this way, it gets a little easier. And we'll see kind of how to do that. And then Bootstrap, to be honest, makes this a lot easier for us as well. So yeah, it's a great question. Let's take a break. Let's come back at 10:30. Cool. Thank you, folks.